Okay, so I will begin again. So in this talk today, I want to introduce the increasing representation of literati masters' images in popular literature from the temple era around the 1830s, and from there discuss the possible ways to visualize the literati profiting network to better understand this complicated network as well as what it entails. I situate this discussion of primary sources today in the increasing production of shogakai illustrations in popular fiction, literary rankings, as well as painting collections in the 1830s, particularly between 1837 and 1839. This discussion is a part of my book project that examines the socioeconomic roles of shogakai, or calligraphy and painting gatherings during the 19th century. It is also a bit of a messy part of my project due to the complicated collaboration or sponsorship relationships among these popular authors. So one of the figures I have been looking into is Hatagenki. And these collaboration relationships that I have been studying too also kind of began from here because I noticed several illustrations in vernacular fiction from this period depicted scenes from shogakai gatherings. In some of the works, the illustrations had nothing to do with the plot of the fiction. And some of the illustrations were extremely minimal and could not really show any of the featured figures' faces. Nonetheless, each of the figures had their names clearly indicated next to their images, like this one shows. So this work here, Saketori Monogatari, for example, is a parody of Taketori Monogatari. It was written by Hatagenki, a vernacular writer, a kyoka poet, and also a doctor, supposedly, who lived between 1790 to 1870 in Edo. Ginke added this illustration of multiple pages in this work to portray a scene from a shogakai gathering, even though the story had nothing to do with the shogakai. And here's another example, also from Ginke's work, Amano Ukihashi, from about the same time. As the title of this illustration shows, Ginke held shogakai gatherings at his residence around this time on the 25th day of each month. It was one of the most famous monthly gatherings around the Ryogoku area because Ginke was living in Kameido and Yoshiwara at the time. So similarly, this illustration also featured many figures. In this work, Ginke featured about 60 masters with their names listed next to them. This phenomenon was not unique in Ginke's works. Another kyoka poet, Kinoshita Bayan, we do not know when he was born or died, but he was also a kyoka poet and also a doctor. He was also Ginke's acquaintance. Kinoshita Bayan attended shogakai around the time from around the 1840s, and he also compiled collections that had illustrations such as this, Edo Meibutsushi, which is a kind of an introduction of famous objects or people or stores in Edo. In this illustration, interestingly, he made sure to feature Ginke as well. Returning to Ginke, apart from illustrations with an extensive amount of featured figures, Ginke also made several literary rankings, or bunjin banzuke. This ranking, for instance, Edo Gogetsu Bunjin Suikoden, features 108 figures, including contemporary and deceased at the time, with each figure given a character from the popular Chinese vernacular fiction, The Water Margin, Suikoden. However, rather than a ranking, this one is more like a list of names because it does not actually indicate a hierarchy. So the order of this list does not actually follow any of the ranking of these 108 water margin heroes, which is what many ukiyo-e artists followed at the time. And many of these figures featured in this list did not leave behind any work for them to be known today. And from Tokugawa period sources, it's also questionable whether all of these people even deserve to be on this list. Um, this list furthermore avoided assigning characters to several of the figures who I have confirmed to have had other kinds of exchange relationships with Ginke. I will talk more about this in a bit, but at the time, many other literary rankings did not technically indicate hierarchy, so they were not rankings per se. And as Ibi Takashi pointed out, this was in part to avoid conflict among the networks. And I think the interesting thing here to note is these extensive lists that we can compare among the literati ranking around the time. This similar phenomenon can be observed from painting collections or painting calligraphy collections or shogashu generally, like this one. So Shoga Waisui is a series of collections of famous painters, calligraphers, poets, seal carvers from the late Tokugawa period. It was published between 1838 and 1861 with 6 volumes. Each volume documented at least 50 figures, so that's roughly 300 masters. That's a lot of famous masters. The collection gives a short biography for some of the figures, and each figure got to have one of a piece of their masterpiece featured in this collection. But similar to the water margin ranking, many of the famous masters from this collection are now unknown. They had neither works left behind nor detailed biographical information, and in some cases, there was also cash exchange involved that I don't have time to get into detail today, but I will happy to answer later in the Q&A. But in some other of these kind of collections, it may also have been exchange of favors, as we see a lot of this kind of cross-featuring in different authors' works. So to give an example, I want to return to the water margin ranking for a second. So we see 6 listed facilitators or assistants from the ranking as listed in the top part of this image. And then under here, we see 2 editors, Usami Sanbin and Miki Izan, listed next to Hete Ginke or Hirata Ginke. So these are the 2 figures that I have been looking into, Usami Sanbin and Miki Izan. So Ginke listed them as the editor here, but their information does not really appear in many other works. So Miki Izan was a Confucian scholar, a polymath, according to other Jingmei Roku or rankings. He was also the author of several comedic fiction as well as literary rankings. But none of them were bestsellers, and his name doesn't really appear in anybody else's fiction. And Usami Sanbin was listed as a vernacular writer in some other rankings, but there is no further information about him anywhere. We don't know the birth or death years for either of them, and they don't really seem to appear in many other works. They seem to only repeatedly appear in Ginke's illustrations, rankings, and painting collections. But they do appear in each other's works. So in the few literary rankings that Miki Izan or Miki Kusai made, we can also find Ginke and Usami Sanbin's names listed alongside some of the best-selling vernacular writers of the time. So Usami Sanbin, for example, was listed as equivalent to Okajima Kanzan or Morishima Hoshu, and Hirata Ginke was Hete Ginke, apologies, was listed right next to Bakin, Shikite Sanbai, and Santo Kyoden. So I thought this phenomenon was quite curious and moreover suspicious, considering the 3 of them were not really famous for their vernacular works. It's also notable that although these rankings sometimes listed the cultural skills that the person was supposed to be good at, it was not always consistent, which was not unusual considering that most of these people practiced multiple skills. But the lack of consistency in the listed skills posed challenge in the data visualization for some of the figures. So in order to portray their complicated collaboration, sponsorship, or competition relationships, I turned to network analysis and visualization for more intuitive portrayal of these relationships. And that's my project on JBDB, Shogakai, and the literati network from the 18th to 20th century. My initial goal was to use data collected from primary sources regarding Shogakai to map out the links between these literati masters to identify the transformation in this group and their identity throughout the 19th century. The primary sources suggest there was more of an emphasis on the visibility and publicity of these people as famous masters. And their exchange of cash and favors added another layer to the relationships. In addition, the lack of faithful characterization and documentation about the featured figures, such as the cultural skills that they were good at, their names, their birth and death years, or even their occupation, made it difficult to give every person detailed data. So that's kind of one of the obstacles I ran into on JBDB was how to characterize these people's relationships and how to characterize their encounter with each other in these rankings or shogakai illustrations. But despite these difficulties, I'm still searching for the answer to the question from my book: who were the literati masters in this story, and what impact did this story have at the time? So for this particular part of visualizing this profiting network, I was challenged with things like how to determine the characterization of the events, meeting, the exchange, or how to add the persons who did not have biographical information. Sometimes I wasn't even sure of the pronunciation of their names, or their names would be rendered in different kanji across different materials. And then technology-wise, I'm still trying to figure out how to use different settings of the visualization for different purposes. So recently, I tested with a different approach to see what results I can get by visualizing the numbers of citations. This means to calculate how many times a name appeared in Ginke's works, as well as how many times the same name appeared in works by authors in Ginke's closed network. And for this part, therefore, I have not yet counted in factors such as occupation, social status, gender, or region. And from there, I got a quite primitive image, actually through Giphy, not through JBDB, but it already showed some interesting results that are more intuitive than analytic. Pretty images aren't always useful, but this graph actually showed me some surprising results. So in this graph, bigger dots are the names that appeared most frequently in Genke's and Mikikusai's works. I was able to put in the data for 4 of Genke's works and 2 of Mikikusai's works. And we can see here we already have a few larger dots and a lot of smaller dots at the edge. The tiny dots on the edge here are figures who only appeared once or twice. And so the smaller side on the right hand is Mikikusai's network. The green dots in the center are people that they both mention, and the larger one on the left is Ginke's mentionings of other people. So when I added in the data from Mikikusai's works as well, we can see here that there begins to show overlap. And my hypothesis is more with adding more works, we will see some of these dots growing bigger, but maybe we will also see some of these more marginalized dots growing bigger as well. But from the if we also take a look at this graph with the labels that shows us who were mentioned the most, I was actually very surprised to see that the person who appeared the most numbers in these works were not the big name literati that are usually considered in existing scholarship as the representative literatus of the Tokugawa period, such as Otanampo or Gyokute Bakin or even Tani Bunjo. It was Amano Masanori, a waka poet whose works appeared actually in the central exam of the college entrance exam last year in Japan. Amano Masanori actually paid Ginki multiple times to appear in his rankings and Shogakai illustrations. And from this graph, it seems like his bribery worked out. We can also see figures such as Murata Baigetsu here to the left a bit, and Shinoda Unpo, who are who's a female Confucian scholar. Murata Baigetsu was a female Nanga artist. Shinoda Unpo was a female Confucian scholar. None of them received none of them really have been able to claim their bunjin title in modern day scholarship, but they appeared a lot of times, or their existence in these works were prominent. Other figures such as Abe Rekisai or Hara Tokusai, who were also active in the Shogakai network but not studied extensively, are also notable mentions from this graph. Of course, there are also the usual masters such as Ishikawa Beian, or in the corner, or Tojo Kindai, who was one of the top attendants of literati networks of the time. But taking these results, I think we'll be able to analyze more deeply with the resources in JBDB by considering if there were any patterns in their occupation, social status, or their region. So again, while these images look pretty, I do keep in mind that these data are biased in nature. What kinds of materials get preserved till this day, or whose works got to be preserved, are all factors that can influence the final result. And with this method, I also couldn't include more layered information. So I think what JBDB is great about is that we can add, like Yoshi just mentioned, the more nuanced information about these images. Moving forward, apart from adding data, which is for now the most time-consuming part, I want to keep helping to refine ways of data entry on JBDB and explore different ways to reflect this supporting, advertising, or profiting relationship among these literati masters.